The gunshot that killed Adelaide Turner's father echoed through the dusty streets of El Dorado Canyon, Nevada, on a scorching afternoon in July 1878, and she didn't scream or faint like the other women watching from their doorways. She just stood there on the wooden sidewalk, her cotton dress plastered to her back with sweat, watching the blood pool in the dirt while her mind went somewhere far away where nothing could touch her. The man who fired the shot, a cattle rustler named Jack Morneau, was already galloping out of town by the time Adelaide's knees finally buckled, and she would have hit the ground hard if strong hands hadn't caught her elbows and steadied her weight. "Easy now," a voice said, low and calm, and Adelaide looked up through the haze of shock to see a cowboy she didn't recognize. He had sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of whiskey, with dark hair that curled slightly at the ends where it touched his collar. He wasn't telling her it would be all right, or that everything happens for a reason, or any of the useless things people always said. He just held her steady until she found her footing again, then stepped back and removed his hat respectfully. "Harrison Pike," he said quietly. "I'm real sorry for your loss, miss." Adelaide wanted to say something, anything, but her throat had closed up tight and her eyes were burning. She managed a slight nod before turning away, walking on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else toward where her father lay in the street. The town doctor, old Samuel Brennan, was already kneeling beside the body, but Adelaide could see from his expression that there was nothing to be done. 23 years old, and she was alone in the world now, with no mother, no siblings, and a father who would never teach her another thing about running the small ranch they owned 5 miles outside of town. The next few days passed in a blur of condolences and casseroles, and people touching her arm with pitying expressions. Adelaide went through the motions of planning a funeral, accepting donations for the burial, and listening to the sheriff promise he would bring Jack Morneau to justice, even though everyone knew Morneau had probably crossed into California by now and would never face a rope for what he'd done. Her father had caught Morneau stealing cattle from their small herd and confronted him in town, and Morneau had simply drawn his gun and fired without a second thought. Adelaide stood at the graveside in her black dress, the only mourning clothes she owned, and watched them lower her father into the hard Nevada ground. The preacher spoke words that meant nothing to her. Neighbors and acquaintances filed past to offer their sympathies. And through it all, Adelaide kept her spine straight and her face composed, because she had learned long ago that crying in front of people only made them uncomfortable and led to useless advice or patronizing comfort. When everyone finally left and she was alone at the cemetery on the edge of town, Adelaide allowed herself to walk back to the grave and look down at the fresh-turned earth. Her father had been a hard man, not given to shows of affection, but he had been fair, and he had taught her everything he knew about horses and cattle and surviving in this harsh land. Now she would have to figure out how to keep the ranch running by herself, or else sell it for whatever pittance she could get and try to find work as a seamstress or laundress in town. The thought of selling made her stomach twist. That ranch was all she had left of her family, of the life her parents had built when they came west from Missouri 15 years ago. Her mother had died of fever when Adelaide was 12, and her father had never been quite the same after that, but they had made it work. They had built something out of nothing in this unforgiving desert. Adelaide walked back toward town as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. The heat was finally breaking, giving way to the cool that would settle over the canyon once darkness fell. She had left her horse at the livery stable and needed to collect it before heading back to the ranch, where she would spend her first night completely alone. The stable was dim and smelled of hay and horse sweat. Old Pete, who ran the place, had already left for the day, but he knew Adelaide well enough to trust her to collect her mare without supervision. She was reaching for her saddle when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Harrison Pike standing in the doorway, his silhouette backlit by the fading sunlight. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said, stepping inside. "I was hoping I might catch you before you headed out to your place." Adelaide set the saddle down and waited, unsure what this stranger could possibly want with her. She had seen him around town a few times since the shooting, always at a distance, always seeming to be occupied with his own business. Harrison moved closer, and she could see his face more clearly now in the dim light filtering through the stable slats. He had a strong jaw and a straight nose that looked like it had been broken at least once, and there was something steady in his expression that made her feel like he was actually seeing her instead of just looking at her. "I've been working for the Copper Creek Ranch about 10 miles south of here," he said. "Been there about 6 months now, but I heard you might be in need of some help with your place, and I wanted to offer my services." Adelaide blinked, caught off guard. "I don't have money to pay ranch hands," she said flatly. "My father kept our operation small for a reason." "I'm not asking for money," Harrison said. "Just room and board and maybe a cut of any profits if we manage to turn things around. I know it's not my business, but I also know that running a ranch alone is near impossible, especially for someone who just lost their only help." There was no pity in his voice, just practical assessment, and Adelaide appreciated that more than he could know. Still, she was wary. She didn't know this man, didn't know his character or his skills or why he would offer to work for nothing more than food and shelter. "Why would you do that?" she asked, crossing her arms over her chest. "You've got steady work at Copper Creek. Why leave that for an uncertain prospect?" Harrison was quiet for a moment, his gaze steady on hers. "Because I saw what happened to your father and I saw how you handled yourself after. You didn't fall apart. You didn't beg for help. You just kept moving forward. That takes strength, and I respect that. I figure if you're willing to fight to keep your land, then maybe it's worth fighting for." Adelaide studied his face, looking for any sign of deception or ulterior motive. She had dealt with enough men in her life to know that most of them had angles, reasons for doing things that benefited them more than anyone else. But Harrison Pike just stood there calmly, letting her look her fill, not trying to convince or cajole. "I would need to think about it," she finally said. "Fair enough," Harrison replied. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. "I'm staying at the boarding house on 3rd Street, room 6. You can send word there if you decide you want the help." He handed her the paper, tipped his hat, and walked back out into the fading light, leaving Adelaide standing in the stable with her thoughts spinning. She didn't know if she could trust him, but she also knew he was right about one thing. Running the ranch alone would be nearly impossible. She had maybe 50 head of cattle, a dozen horses, and a homestead that needed constant maintenance to keep from falling apart in the harsh desert climate. Her father had been struggling to manage it all even before his death. Adelaide saddled her mare and rode out to the ranch as dusk settled over the canyon. The land stretched out around her in shades of purple and gray, dotted with sage and Joshua trees. It was beautiful in its own stark way, and it was hers. She would fight to keep it if she could, but she needed to be smart about how she did that. The ranch house was small, just 3 rooms, but it was solidly built and had a good well nearby. Adelaide put her horse in the corral, fed the animals, and went inside to light the lamps. The silence was oppressive. She had been alone here before when her father went to town for supplies, but this was different. This was permanent. She made herself a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, ate without tasting, and cleaned up. Then she sat in her father's chair by the cold fireplace and let herself think about Harrison Pike's offer. It was risky, bringing a stranger onto the property. But it was also risky trying to do everything herself. She could hire day workers from town, but that would cost money she didn't have. At least with Harrison's proposal, she would only be paying in food and shelter, things she had to provide for herself anyway. Adelaide went to bed that night without making a decision, but she didn't sleep well. She kept thinking about her father's face in those last moments, the surprise in his eyes when Morneau pulled the trigger. She kept thinking about how quickly everything could be taken away, how fragile the life she had built really was. The next morning, she rose before dawn and did her chores, then saddled her mare and rode back into El Dorado Canyon. The town was just beginning to wake up when she reached the boarding house on 3rd Street. Mrs. Chen, who ran the place, directed her to room 6, and Adelaide climbed the narrow stairs with her heart beating harder than it should. She knocked, and Harrison opened the door almost immediately, like he had been expecting her. He was in his shirt sleeves, his hair still damp from washing, and there was a flicker of something in his eyes when he saw her standing there. "I'll take you up on your offer," Adelaide said without preamble, "but I have conditions. You work hard and you earn your keep. You don't drink to excess and you don't bring trouble to my property. And if I tell you to leave, you leave without argument. Are we clear?" A slow smile spread across Harrison's face, and Adelaide noticed for the first time that he had a small scar at the corner of his mouth. "Crystal clear, Miss Turner. When do you want me to start? Today, if you can manage it. I'll need to collect my things and let the foreman at Copper Creek know I'm moving on, but I can be at your place by this afternoon." Adelaide nodded and turned to leave, then paused and looked back at him. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for offering." "Thank you for accepting," Harrison replied, and there was something warm in his voice that made Adelaide's chest feel tight. She rode back to the ranch and threw herself into work, trying not to think too hard about what she had just done. By the time Harrison arrived in the late afternoon, with his belongings packed on a sturdy bay gelding, Adelaide had mucked out the stables, repaired a section of fence, and started taking inventory of their supplies. Harrison surveyed the property with an experienced eye, noting the condition of the buildings, the quality of the horses in the corral, the lay of the land. Adelaide watched him trying to gauge his thoughts. "It's good land," he finally said. "Your father built something solid here. We can make it work." The word "we" should have felt presumptuous, but instead it just felt like relief. Adelaide showed him where he could bunk in the small room attached to the barn, a space her father had used for storage but which had a cot and enough room for a man to sleep comfortably. Harrison didn't complain about the accommodations. He just set his things down, changed into work clothes, and asked what needed doing. They worked side by side until dark, and Adelaide was impressed by how much Harrison knew about ranching. He could fix a broken harness, gentle a nervous horse, and assess the health of cattle with just a glance. He worked efficiently and without complaint, and he didn't try to tell Adelaide how to run her own property, which she appreciated more than anything. That night, Adelaide cooked dinner for both of them, a simple meal of salt pork and potatoes and beans. They ate at the small table in her kitchen, and the silence between them was comfortable rather than awkward. Harrison had a quiet way about him that Adelaide found soothing. He didn't fill the air with unnecessary words, didn't ask prying questions about her life or her plans. "Where are you from originally?" Adelaide finally asked as she cleared the dishes. "Kansas," Harrison said. "My family had a farm outside of Lawrence, lost it during the war." He didn't elaborate, and Adelaide didn't push. Everyone out west had a story, and most of those stories involved loss of some kind. That's why people came here, to start over and build something new. The days settled into a rhythm after that. Adelaide and Harrison would rise before dawn, do the morning chores, then spend the day working on whatever needed attention. They repaired fences, moved cattle to better grazing, broke in some of the younger horses. Harrison proved to be not just capable but invaluable, and Adelaide found herself wondering how she would have managed without him. 2 weeks after Harrison arrived, they had a setback. 3 of their best steers went missing, and when Adelaide and Harrison tracked them, they found evidence that someone had cut the fence and driven the animals off deliberately. Adelaide felt the familiar burn of anger in her chest, the same anger she had felt watching Jack Morneau ride away after killing her father. "Rustlers," Harrison said quietly, examining the tracks. "Probably the same ones who have been hitting other ranches in the area." "We can't afford to lose livestock," Adelaide said tightly. "Every head of cattle counts." "I know. We'll need to start posting watch at night, taking shifts, and we should ride into town tomorrow, let the sheriff know what happened." Adelaide wanted to argue that the sheriff was useless, that he hadn't even caught her father's killer, but she knew Harrison was right. They had to at least report the theft. That night, Harrison took the first watch while Adelaide tried to sleep. But she was too restless, too angry about the stolen cattle, and too worried about what would happen if the rustlers came back. Around midnight, she gave up and walked out to where Harrison was sitting on the porch of the barn, his rifle across his knees. "Can't sleep?" he asked as she approached. "Too much on my mind." Harrison nodded and shifted over on the bench, making room for her to sit. Adelaide settled beside him, and they sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the desert. A coyote yipped in the distance, and one of the horses whickered softly in response. "I keep thinking about my father," Adelaide said suddenly, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "About how he died for 3 steers that weren't even worth $50 total. About how someone can just take a life like it means nothing." Harrison was quiet beside her, and Adelaide felt the familiar tightness in her throat that came before tears. She had been holding everything in for weeks now, staying strong and capable and in control, but sitting here in the darkness with Harrison's solid presence beside her, something inside her was cracking. "I'm angry all the time," she continued, her voice shaking. "And I'm scared. I'm scared I'll lose the ranch, scared I'll fail, scared that all of this is for nothing." The tears came then, hot and sudden, streaming down her face before she could stop them. Adelaide put her hands over her face, embarrassed and ashamed, waiting for Harrison to say something comforting or to tell her she needed to be strong or to assure her that everything would be fine. But Harrison didn't say anything at all. He just sat there quietly beside her, his shoulder touching hers, his presence steady and calm. He didn't try to fix her pain or minimize it or rush her through it. He just let her cry, and that somehow made it easier to let the tears come. Adelaide cried for her father, for her mother, for the life she had thought she would have, and the uncertain future that stretched ahead of her. She cried until her throat was raw and her eyes were swollen, and she had nothing left inside her but emptiness. When she finally lowered her hands and wiped her face with her sleeve, Harrison was still sitting there, still quiet, still just present. He didn't look uncomfortable or impatient. He just looked at her with those steady, whiskey-colored eyes and waited. "I'm sorry," Adelaide said, her voice hoarse. "Nothing to be sorry for," Harrison replied simply. "You must think I'm weak. I think you're one of the strongest people I've ever met, and I think you've been carrying a heavy load all by yourself for too long." Something shifted in Adelaide's chest, a warmth spreading through the cold, empty places that the crying had left behind. She had never had anyone who stayed quiet when she cried. Her father had always gotten awkward and left the room. Friends growing up had tried to smother her with sympathy or give advice she didn't want. But Harrison just sat there quietly with her, and that simple act of presence meant more than all the words in the world. "Thank you," she said softly. Harrison nodded, and they sat together in silence for a while longer before Adelaide finally went back to the house to try to sleep. This time, she managed a few hours of rest, and when she woke in the morning, she felt lighter somehow, like the crying had released some of the pressure that had been building inside her. They rode into town that day to report the theft to Sheriff Morrison, who took their statement with about as much enthusiasm as Adelaide expected. Morrison was in his 50s, more politician than lawman, and he had a talent for looking busy without actually accomplishing anything. "I'll keep an eye out," he promised, making notes in his ledger. "But you know how it is with rustlers. They move fast and cover their tracks. Chances are those steers are already sold and butchered." Adelaide bit back the sharp reply on her tongue and thanked the sheriff for his time. As she and Harrison walked back out onto the street, she noticed people watching them with curious eyes. By now, word had surely spread that Adelaide Turner had taken on a hired hand, and in a town the size of El Dorado Canyon, that was enough to fuel gossip for weeks. "Miss Turner." A voice called, and Adelaide turned to see Martha Henderson, the banker's wife, hurrying toward them with her parasol bobbing. "I heard about your trouble with the rustlers. Such a terrible thing. You know, my husband was just saying last night that it's really too much for a young woman to manage a ranch alone. Perhaps you should consider selling before things get worse." Adelaide forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Henderson, but I'm managing just fine." Martha's gaze slid to Harrison and her eyebrows rose slightly. "Yes, I can see you've found help, though I do hope you're being careful about propriety, dear. People do talk." "Let them talk," Adelaide said, her voice cool. "Good day, Mrs. Henderson." She walked away before the woman could respond, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Harrison fell into step beside her, and she could feel him glancing at her, but he didn't comment on the exchange. "Nosy old bat," Adelaide muttered when they were out of earshot. "People in small towns always are," Harrison replied mildly. "They don't have enough of their own business to mind." Despite her irritation, Adelaide felt a smile tugging at her lips. There was something refreshing about Harrison's straightforward way of seeing things. They stopped at the general store to pick up supplies, and while Adelaide was selecting flour and sugar, she overheard two cowboys talking near the front counter. "Heard Jack Morno got himself shot down in California," one of them said. "Some saloon fight over cards." Adelaide's hand froze on the bag of flour. Jack Morno was dead. The man who killed her father would never face justice, would never pay for what he had done. He had simply died in a meaningless brawl hundreds of miles away. She should have felt something, relief or satisfaction, or at least closure. But all she felt was a hollow sense of futility. Her father was still dead. Morno being dead didn't change that or make it better. Harrison appeared at her elbow, his expression telling her he had heard the same conversation. He didn't say anything, just took the heavy bag of flour from her hands and carried it to the counter. Adelaide followed numbly, paid for their supplies, and walked out into the bright Nevada sunshine. They loaded everything onto the wagon they had brought and started the drive back to the ranch. Adelaide stared at the dusty road ahead, her mind churning. "Does it bother you that I don't feel anything about Morno being dead?" she asked suddenly. Harrison considered the question. "No. Revenge and justice are two different things." Him being dead doesn't give you your father back or make what happened right. It's just another death in a world that already has too many. Everyone expects me to be happy about it, to feel like it's finally over. Everyone expects a lot of things that don't match up with reality. You feel what you feel. That's all you can do. Adelaide looked over at him, at his profile against the desert landscape, and felt that warmth in her chest again. Harrison had a way of seeing straight through to the heart of things, of understanding without judgment. The summer dragged on, hot and dry, and Adelaide and Harrison worked from dawn to dusk, keeping the ranch running. They moved the cattle to find better grazing, hauled water when the creek ran low, and took turns keeping watch for rustlers. The work was hard and relentless, but Adelaide found she didn't mind it as much when Harrison was there to share the load. She also found herself noticing things about him that had nothing to do with his skill as a ranch hand. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the quiet strength in his hands when he worked with the horses, the sound of his laugh, rare but genuine, when something struck him as funny. One evening in late August, they were sitting on the porch of the house after dinner, watching the sun set over the mountains. Adelaide had made a peach cobbler with fruit from the trees behind the house, and Harrison had proclaimed it the best thing he had eaten in months. "You're a good cook," he said, scraping the last bit of cobbler from his bowl. Among other talents, Adelaide felt her cheeks warm. "My mother taught me before she died. She always said a woman should know how to feed herself and others, no matter what else she could do. Smart woman." "She was. I wish I had known her longer. I was only 12 when the fever took her." Harrison set his bowl aside and leaned back in his chair. "Tell me about her." So Adelaide did, sharing memories she hadn't spoken aloud in years. She told him about her mother's garden, about the songs she used to sing while doing chores, about the way she could make even their small, rough house feel like a home. Harrison listened attentively, asking occasional questions, and Adelaide realized this was the most she had talked about her family to anyone. "She sounds wonderful," Harrison said when Adelaide finally fell silent. "She was. My father was never quite the same after she died. I think part of him died too, and he was just going through the motions after that. Grief does that to people sometimes." Adelaide looked over at Harrison. "Have you lost people?" "My parents died when I was 16. Cholera took them both within a week of each other. I had 2 younger sisters who went to live with our aunt in Ohio. I headed west to try to make enough money to send for them, but by the time I had anything saved, they had both married and started families of their own. Don't see them much anymore. Do you miss them?" "Every day. But life moves on whether we're ready for it or not." They sat in companionable silence as the sky turned from orange to purple to deep blue, and Adelaide felt something settling inside her, a sense of rightness she hadn't felt in a long time. Having Harrison here had changed everything about the ranch and about her life, and she was starting to realize that what she felt for him went beyond gratitude or friendship. She was falling in love with him, and that terrified her. Adelaide had never been in love before. There had been a boy back when she was 17, a neighbor's son who had courted her for a few months, but it had been a shallow thing that fizzled out when he moved to California with his family. This felt different, deeper, like something that could grow roots and become permanent if she let it. But what if Harrison didn't feel the same way? What if he was only here because he needed work and a place to stay? What if she opened her heart to him, and he left like everyone else in her life had left, one way or another? The questions kept Adelaide awake that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the night sounds through her open window. She could hear the cattle lowing softly in the distance, could hear the wind rustling through the sage. And underlying it all, she could hear the steady presence of Harrison in the barn, keeping watch, keeping her safe. September brought slightly cooler temperatures and the promise of fall, though in Nevada the seasons changed more slowly than they had back in Missouri. Adelaide and Harrison made plans to drive some of their cattle to market in Las Vegas, a grueling 3-day journey each way but necessary to bring in the money they needed to make it through the winter. They set out on a Monday morning with 20 head of cattle and enough supplies for a week on the trail. Adelaide had made the drive before with her father, so she knew what to expect, but it was still hard work keeping the cattle moving and preventing them from straying. On the second night, they made camp near a small creek and built a fire to cook their dinner. The cattle were settled and quiet, and the sky above was so full of stars it looked like someone had spilled salt across black velvet. "It's beautiful out here," Harrison said, looking up at the sky. "Sometimes I forget to notice it when I'm caught up in the work." "I know what you mean," Adelaide replied. She was sitting close to the fire, grateful for its warmth now that the sun had gone down. "My mother used to say that if you're too busy to notice beauty, you're too busy." She was right. Harrison moved to sit beside Adelaide, and she was acutely aware of his nearness, of the warmth radiating from his body, of the way the firelight played across his features. Her heart was beating faster than it should, and she told herself to calm down, to not read more into this than there was. "Adelaide," Harrison said quietly, and it was the first time he had used her given name instead of calling her Miss Turner. "Can I ask you something, of course? Why did you really accept my offer to work here? I know you needed help, but you could have found that elsewhere. Why take a chance on a stranger?" Adelaide thought about how to answer, how much truth to reveal. "Because you didn't look at me like I was broken," she finally said. "After my father died, everyone in town looked at me with pity or like I was fragile and might shatter at any moment. But you just looked at me like I was a person who had suffered a loss and needed help, not a victim, not a charity case, just someone worth helping." Harrison was quiet for a moment, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "You're the furthest thing from broken I've ever seen. You're strong and capable and brave, and I've been in awe of you since the day I met you." Adelaide's breath caught. "Harrison, I know it's not my place to say this," he continued, his voice low and earnest. "I know I'm just a hired hand and you're my employer, and there are probably a dozen reasons why I should keep my mouth shut. But I need you to know that these past few months working beside you have been the best of my life. And if I'm reading this wrong, if I'm seeing something that isn't there, just tell me and I'll never mention it again." "You're not reading it wrong," Adelaide whispered, her heart in her throat. "I feel it too. I've been feeling it for weeks now and trying to tell myself I was imagining things." Harrison reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and cupped her face gently in his hand. His palm was warm and rough with calluses, and Adelaide leaned into the touch without thinking. "I'm falling in love with you, Adelaide Turner," Harrison said, his voice rough with emotion. "And I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere. I'm not leaving. I'll stay as long as you'll have me." Adelaide felt tears prickling at her eyes, but these were different from the tears she had cried that night on the barn porch. These were tears of relief and joy and hope for the future. "I'm falling in love with you too," she said. And then Harrison was kissing her, gentle and sweet, like she was something precious that might break if he wasn't careful. Adelaide kissed him back, pouring all her feelings into it, all the loneliness and fear and hope that had been building inside her. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Harrison rested his forehead against hers. "We're going to make this work," he said firmly. "The ranch, us, all of it. I promise you that." "I believe you," Adelaide replied, and she did. They sat together by the fire until it burned down to embers, talking about their hopes and dreams and the future they might build together. Harrison told her about his plans to expand the herd gradually, to maybe buy some sheep as well to diversify their income. Adelaide shared her dream of building a bigger house someday, something with a proper parlor and bedrooms for the children she hoped to have. "How many children are we talking about?" Harrison asked with a grin. "I don't know. 3, maybe 4 if we can manage it." "I like the sound of that. A house full of life and noise and laughter." They made it to Las Vegas 2 days later and sold their cattle for a good price. Adelaide used some of the money to buy supplies and new tools they needed, and she splurged on a bolt of blue fabric that caught her eye, thinking maybe she could make a new dress for special occasions. The journey back to El Dorado Canyon felt shorter somehow, even though they were traveling the same distance. Adelaide and Harrison talked and laughed and made plans, and Adelaide felt lighter than she had in years, like the heavy weight she had been carrying had finally lifted. When they arrived back at the ranch, Harrison helped Adelaide unload the wagon, and then he hesitated, looking uncertain for the first time since Adelaide had known him. "What is it?" she asked. "I was thinking maybe I should move into the house," he said carefully. "Or rather, I was thinking maybe we should talk about getting married, if that's something you would want." Adelaide's heart skipped a beat. "Are you proposing to me, Harrison Pike?" "I suppose I am, though I'm doing a terrible job of it. I don't have a ring or any fancy words prepared. I just know that I love you and I want to spend my life with you and I want to do things properly." Adelaide stepped closer to him, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." Harrison's face broke into the biggest smile Adelaide had ever seen on him, and he picked her up and spun her around, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, he kissed her again, deeper this time, and Adelaide felt like her heart might burst from happiness. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church in El Dorado Canyon. Adelaide wore a new dress she had sewn from the blue fabric, and Harrison wore his best suit and looked so handsome that Adelaide could hardly believe he was really hers. The whole town turned out for the wedding, even the people who had gossiped about the propriety of Adelaide living on the ranch with Harrison before they were married. Martha Henderson made a few snide comments about rushed weddings, but Adelaide ignored her. She had learned that some people would always find something to criticize, and their opinions didn't matter. What mattered was the man standing beside her, promising to love and cherish her for the rest of their lives. The reception was held at the ranch, and neighbors brought food and drink and wedding gifts. Someone brought a fiddle and there was dancing, and Adelaide danced with her new husband under the stars, feeling like she was floating. "Happy," Harrison murmured in her ear as they swayed to the music. "Happier than I ever thought I could be," Adelaide replied honestly. That night, after all the guests had left and they were finally alone, Harrison carried Adelaide over the threshold of the house that was now truly theirs. They made love slowly and tenderly, learning each other's bodies, and Adelaide felt a completeness she had never known before. The next morning, they woke up tangled together in Adelaide's bed, the sun streaming through the window. Harrison kissed her forehead and told her he would go make coffee, and Adelaide lay there for a moment just savoring the feeling of contentment. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. They were partners now in every sense of the word, working together during the day and sharing a bed at night. Harrison was true to his word about expanding the ranch, and over the next few months, they bought more cattle and started building a new barn to house them. Winter came, and with it, the occasional cold snap that made the desert nights frigid. Adelaide and Harrison would huddle together by the fireplace, planning for spring and dreaming about the future. Adelaide taught Harrison how to make her mother's recipes, and he taught her some card games he had learned in his years of traveling. One evening in January, Adelaide realized her monthly courses were late. She waited another week to be sure before telling Harrison, and when she finally shared the news that she thought she might be pregnant, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. "A baby," he said wonderingly, placing his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Adelaide asked, suddenly nervous. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it," Harrison replied, pulling her into his arms. "I'm over the moon. I'm going to be a father." Adelaide relaxed into his embrace, feeling safe and loved and excited for what was to come. The pregnancy was confirmed by the doctor a few weeks later, and Harrison immediately became even more protective than he had been before, insisting that Adelaide not overwork herself and taking on extra chores to spare her. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," Adelaide protested one morning when Harrison tried to prevent her from mucking out the stables. "I know, but I worry. I just want to make sure you and the baby are safe." Adelaide softened at the concern in his voice. "We're safe. We're both healthy and strong. But I appreciate you caring so much." Spring brought new growth to the land and new challenges to the ranch. They had a difficult calving season with several cows having trouble birthing, but Harrison's experience and steady hands helped them get through it without losing too many animals. Adelaide's belly grew rounder as the weeks passed, and she found herself having to adjust her clothes and eventually make new ones to accommodate her changing shape. In early June, Adelaide went into labor. It was long and difficult, and there were moments when she was certain she couldn't do it, couldn't push through the pain. But Harrison was there beside her the whole time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth and telling her how strong and brave she was. "I can't," she sobbed at one point, exhausted and hurting. "I can't do this anymore." "You can," Harrison said firmly, his eyes locked on hers. "You're the strongest person I know, Adelaide. You can do this." And somehow she did. Their daughter was born just after midnight, a tiny perfect thing with a shock of dark hair and lungs that worked just fine. Harrison cried when the midwife placed the baby in his arms, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his daughter with wonder. "She's perfect," he whispered. "She's absolutely perfect." They named her Emma Rose after both their mothers, and Adelaide felt her heart expand to hold this new overwhelming love she felt for her child. Those first few weeks were exhausting, filled with sleepless nights and learning how to care for an infant, but Adelaide and Harrison figured it out together. Harrison was a devoted father, changing diapers and walking the floor with Emma when she was fussy and singing silly songs to make her stop crying. Adelaide would watch them together and feel such a surge of love for both of them that it almost hurt. "I never knew I could be this happy," she told Harrison one night as they lay in bed with Emma asleep in her cradle beside them. "Me neither," Harrison replied, lacing his fingers through hers. "You've given me everything, Adelaide. A home, a family, a purpose. I spent so many years just drifting from place to place, never feeling like I belonged anywhere. But with you, I finally found where I'm supposed to be." Adelaide squeezed his hand, too full of emotion to speak. She thought about that day in town when Harrison had caught her as she stumbled after her father's death. She thought about all the moments since then, all the times he had been there for her, steady and sure and true. She thought about that night when she had cried and he had just sat there quietly with her, not trying to fix anything, just being present. That had been the beginning of everything, she realized. That simple act of staying quiet when she cried, of giving her space to feel what she needed to feel without judgment or platitudes. That was when she had started to fall in love with him, even if she hadn't recognized it at the time. The years passed quickly after that, full of hard work and small joys and the everyday rhythms of ranch life. They had 2 more children, a son they named Henry, and then another daughter they called Margaret. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts, and they were able to build the bigger house Adelaide had dreamed of, with a proper parlor and enough bedrooms for their growing family. Harrison proved to be as good a father as he was a husband, patient and loving and always willing to get down on the floor and play with the children. Adelaide would sometimes watch him teaching Henry how to rope cattle or playing dolls with Emma and Margaret, and feel such gratitude for this man who had come into her life when she needed him most. They had their share of hardships, too. There were years when the drought made grazing scarce, and they had to sell off part of the herd. There was a fire that destroyed the old barn and nearly spread to the house before they managed to contain it. Harrison broke his leg badly one winter and was laid up for months, leaving Adelaide to manage most of the ranch work while caring for 3 young children. But they weathered every storm together, leaning on each other when times were tough and celebrating together when things went well. Their love deepened and matured, becoming something even stronger than those first heady days of falling for each other. One evening, nearly 10 years after they had married, Adelaide and Harrison were sitting on the porch of their house watching the sun set. The children were inside getting ready for bed, and the ranch was quiet and peaceful. "You ever regret it?" Adelaide asked suddenly. "Giving up your wandering life to settle down here?" Harrison looked at her in surprise. "Not for a single second. Why would you ask that?" "I don't know. I just want to make sure you're happy, that this life is enough for you." Harrison took her hand and brought it to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "Adelaide, you and our children are everything to me. This ranch, this life we've built together, it's more than I ever dreamed I could have. I'm not just happy. I'm content in a way I never knew was possible." Adelaide leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the familiar comfort of his presence. "I love you, Harrison Pike." "I love you too, Adelaide Pike." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn colors, and Adelaide thought about how far they had come from that awful day when her father was shot. She had been so lost and scared and alone, and she had never imagined that out of that tragedy could come something so beautiful. But that was the nature of life, she had learned. Pain and joy were often intertwined, and sometimes the darkest moments led to the brightest futures. She had lost her father, but she had gained a husband and children and a life full of love and purpose. Emma came running out onto the porch, her nightgown flapping around her ankles. "Papa, Henry says I can't rope as good as him, and it's not fair." Harrison laughed and scooped his daughter up into his arms. "Well, we'll just have to prove him wrong tomorrow, won't we? I'll give you some extra lessons." Emma beamed and threw her arms around Harrison's neck. "You're the best papa in the whole world, and you're the best daughter. Now, off to bed with you. Your mother and I will be in to tuck you all in shortly." Emma scampered back inside, and Adelaide smiled at her husband. "You spoil them." "Of course I do. That's what fathers are for." They went inside together and tucked each child into bed, listening to their prayers and kissing them good night. Then they retreated to their own bedroom and got ready for sleep, falling into the familiar routine they had developed over the years. As Adelaide lay in Harrison's arms that night, safe and warm and loved, she thought about all the people who had told her to sell the ranch after her father died. All the people who had doubted she could make it work. All the people who had whispered about propriety and rushed weddings and a young woman living alone with a man. She was glad she hadn't listened to any of them. She was glad she had trusted her instincts and taken a chance on Harrison Pike. She was glad she had fought to keep the ranch and build a life on her own terms. Most of all, she was glad that Harrison had been the kind of man who knew how to sit quietly with her when she cried. who understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone is just to be present with them in their pain. That simple act of compassion had changed everything, had opened the door to a love and a life beyond anything Adelaide had imagined possible. The years continued to unfold, bringing new challenges and new blessings. Their children grew strong and capable, learning to work the ranch alongside their parents. Emma developed her father's way with horses and could gentle even the most skittish animal. Henry showed a talent for business and helped negotiate better prices when they sold their cattle. Little Margaret inherited Adelaide's gift for cooking and often helped her mother prepare meals for the family. By the time Adelaide turned 40, the ranch was one of the most successful in the area. They had weathered economic downturns, droughts, harsh winters, and all the other trials that came with living in the unforgiving Nevada desert. But they had survived and even thrived, building something lasting and good. Harrison's hair had gone gray at the temples, and Adelaide had laugh lines around her eyes from years of smiling. But they were still deeply in love, still partners in every sense of the word. They still sat together on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the mountains they had come to call home. One such evening when Emma was 17, Henry was 15, and Margaret was 12, Adelaide found herself thinking about the future. Emma had started receiving attention from some of the young men in town, and Adelaide knew it wouldn't be long before her daughter was courting and thinking about marriage and a family of her own. "They're growing up so fast," she said to Harrison. "Sometimes I wish I could freeze time and keep them little forever." "I know what you mean," Harrison replied, "but we've raised them well. They're good kids with good heads on their shoulders. They'll make their own way in the world just like we did. I hope they find what we found. Love and partnership and someone who understands them completely." Harrison pulled Adelaide closer. "They will. We've shown them what a good marriage looks like. They'll know what to look for and what to accept." Adelaide smiled and nestled into her husband's embrace. She thought about a piece of advice her mother had given her years ago, something she had almost forgotten until this moment. Her mother had said that the measure of a good marriage wasn't in the grand gestures or the passionate declarations, but in the small, everyday kindnesses, the quiet acts of love and support that built up over time into something unshakable. Harrison had given her those small kindnesses every day for the past 15 years. He had been her partner and her friend, her lover and her confidant. He had stayed when everyone else had left or died or moved on. He had chosen her, and he kept choosing her, day after day after day. "What are you thinking about?" Harrison asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "Just how lucky I am, how grateful I am for everything we've built together." "I'm the lucky one," Harrison said softly. "You gave me a home when I was lost. You gave me purpose and love and a family. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Adelaide Turner Pike." Adelaide turned to kiss him, pouring all her love and gratitude into it. Even after all these years, kissing Harrison still made her heart race. Even after all these years, his touch still made her feel cherished and desired. They were interrupted by a crash from inside the house, followed by Margaret's voice calling. "It wasn't me." Harrison and Adelaide looked at each other and laughed. "We should probably go see what disaster has unfolded now," Harrison said. "Probably," Adelaide agreed, but neither of them moved right away. They just sat there for another moment, holding each other, savoring the peace and contentment of the life they had built. As the years continued to pass, Adelaide watched her children grow into adults. Emma married a kind young rancher from a neighboring property, and Adelaide cried happy tears at the wedding, remembering her own simple ceremony in El Dorado Canyon all those years ago. Henry decided to study law and moved to Carson City, though he came home frequently to visit. Margaret showed an interest in teaching and began working at the small school in town. Harrison and Adelaide became grandparents when Emma had her first child, a little boy with his grandfather's eyes. Harrison was absolutely besotted with his grandson, and Adelaide loved watching her husband rock the baby and sing the same silly songs he had sung to their own children. "We're getting old," Adelaide said one day, watching Harrison play with their grandson in the yard. "Speak for yourself," Harrison replied with a grin. "I'm aging like fine wine." Adelaide laughed and threw a dish towel at him. "You're aging like milk left out in the sun. That's no way to talk to your husband, the father of your children, the love of your life. It's exactly the way to talk to you when you're being ridiculous." Harrison caught the towel and pulled Adelaide close, kissing her soundly. "I love you, you know. I know. I love you too." They stood there in their kitchen, holding each other, and Adelaide marveled at how natural it still felt after all these years. How right. She had been so young and scared when Harrison first came into her life, so uncertain about the future. But he had been patient and steady, and together they had built something beautiful out of the ashes of her grief. As Adelaide approached her 50th birthday, she began to think about legacy and what they would leave behind. The ranch was thriving and would be passed down to their children. They had built a good reputation in the community and had friends who cared about them. But more than that, they had created a family built on love and respect and mutual support. That was the real legacy, Adelaide thought. Not the land or the cattle or the money, but the love they had shared and the example they had set for their children and grandchildren. One warm summer evening, Adelaide and Harrison rode out to the highest point on their property, a rocky outcropping that overlooked the entire ranch. They had ridden up here on their first wedding anniversary and had made it a tradition to come back every year on that date. 27 years, Harrison said, looking out over the land they had worked so hard to build and maintain. "Sometimes it feels like just yesterday that I showed up at that stable and asked if you needed help. And sometimes it feels like we've been together forever," Adelaide added, "in the best possible way." Harrison dismounted and helped Adelaide down from her horse, and they walked to the edge of the outcropping to watch the sun beginning its descent. The land stretched out before them, golden in the fading light, dotted with their cattle and marked by the buildings they had constructed over the years. "We did good, didn't we?" Adelaide asked. "We did great," Harrison corrected. "We took something broken and made it whole. We built a life and a family and a home. I'd say that's more than good." Adelaide leaned against her husband, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. She thought about all the trials they had faced together, all the joys they had shared. She thought about that night when she had cried and Harrison had just sat there quietly with her, giving her the space to feel what she needed to feel. That was still who Harrison was, even after all these years. He was still the man who knew when to speak and when to stay silent, when to offer advice and when to just be present. He was still her rock, her anchor, her home. "You remember that night when I cried about my father and you just sat with me?" Adelaide asked. "Of course I remember. That was the night I knew for certain I was in love with you." Adelaide looked up at him in surprise. "Really? Why?" "Because you trusted me enough to let your guard down. You let me see you at your most vulnerable, and that felt like a gift. Like you were giving me a piece of yourself that you didn't give to anyone else. I had never had anyone who stayed quiet when I cried," Adelaide said softly. "Everyone always wanted to fix it or make it better or tell me it would be okay. But you just sat there quietly with me, and that was exactly what I needed. I figured you didn't need words. You needed someone to just be there and not make you feel like you had to perform or put on a brave face. You needed permission to feel what you were feeling. Adelaide felt tears pricking at her eyes, but these were good tears, tears of gratitude and love. You've been giving me that permission for 27 years. You've been my safe place to fall, the person I can be completely myself with. Do you know how precious that is? Harrison cupped her face gently in his weathered hands, the same hands that had comforted her on that long-ago night, the same hands that had worked beside her to build their life, the same hands that had held their babies and now held their grandchildren. "You've been the same for me," he said quietly. "You've been my home and my heart and the reason I get up every morning. Loving you has been the greatest adventure of my life." Adelaide rose on her toes and kissed him, soft and sweet, and felt the same spark she had felt the first time their lips met all those years ago by the campfire on the way to Las Vegas. Some things never changed, no matter how much time passed. They stood there on that rocky outcropping as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, and Adelaide felt complete. Her life had been marked by loss and grief, but it had also been marked by love and joy and the deep satisfaction of building something meaningful with someone she cherished. "We should head back," Harrison said eventually. "It'll be dark soon." They mounted their horses and rode back down the trail toward the ranch house, where lights were beginning to glow in the windows. Margaret was there with her new husband, and Emma had brought the grandchildren for a visit. The house would be full of noise and laughter and life, just the way Adelaide liked it. As they approached the house, Adelaide could hear her grandchildren squealing with delight over something, and she smiled. This was what it was all about. This was why she and Harrison had worked so hard and fought so fiercely to keep the ranch, not just for themselves, but for the generations that would come after them. They stabled the horses and walked hand in hand toward the house, and Adelaide thought about how far she had come from that scared, grieving 23-year-old standing in the street watching her father's blood pool in the dirt. She had survived and grown and built a life beyond anything she could have imagined, and she had done it with Harrison Pike by her side, the cowboy who had seen her at her lowest moment and hadn't looked away. The man who had offered his help without expecting anything in return. The man who had stayed quiet when she cried and in doing so had shown her what real love looked like. Inside the house, the family gathered for dinner, and Adelaide looked around the table at all the faces she loved. Her children, grown and building their own lives. Their spouses, good people who treated her babies well. Her grandchildren, full of energy and promise. And Harrison, sitting at the head of the table, his eyes meeting hers across the chaos and reflecting the same contentment she felt. After dinner, when the dishes were washed and the children were tucked into bed and the house had finally quieted down, Adelaide and Harrison sat together in their bedroom. Harrison was reading by lamplight and Adelaide was working on some embroidery, and it was all so domestic and comfortable that Adelaide felt her heart swell with love. "Harrison," she said softly. "MMM." He looked up from his book. "Thank you for finding me. Thank you for staying. Thank you for loving me all these years." Harrison set his book aside and pulled Adelaide into his arms. "Thank you for letting me. Thank you for taking a chance on a drifter with nothing to offer but hard work and devotion. Thank you for building this life with me." They held each other in the quiet of their bedroom, and Adelaide thought about all the moments that had led them here. Every choice, every challenge, every triumph and tragedy. It had all been worth it to arrive at this moment, this feeling of absolute rightness. The years continued to unfold, bringing changes and constants in equal measure. Harrison's hair turned completely white, and Adelaide's hands developed arthritis that made some tasks difficult. But they adapted and adjusted, still working together, still supporting each other. When Harrison turned 65, he finally agreed to let Henry and Margaret's husband take over most of the day-to-day operations of the ranch. He and Adelaide remained involved in the big decisions, but they had more time to simply enjoy each other's company and their growing number of grandchildren. They took to sitting on the porch every evening, watching the sun set and talking about everything and nothing. Sometimes Adelaide would bring her knitting, and Harrison would whittle small toys for the grandchildren. Sometimes they would just sit in comfortable silence, not needing words to communicate after so many years together. On their 40th wedding anniversary, the family threw them a big celebration. All their children and grandchildren came, and many of their friends from town. There was food and music and dancing, and Adelaide felt like the luckiest woman alive. Harrison made a toast, his voice still strong despite his age. 40 years ago, I married the most remarkable woman I'd ever met. She was brave and strong and determined to make something of herself despite the hardships she'd faced. She took a chance on me when she had no reason to trust me, and she's been my partner and my love every day since. Adelaide, you've given me a life beyond my wildest dreams. Here's to 40 more years if the good Lord is willing. Everyone cheered and raised their glasses, and Adelaide felt tears streaming down her face. But these were happy tears, tears of joy and gratitude for a life well lived and a love that had endured. Late that night, when all the guests had gone home and the house was quiet, Adelaide and Harrison lay in bed together. Adelaide's head was on Harrison's chest, and she could hear the steady thump of his heart. "That was a wonderful party," she said softly. "It was, but I'm glad it's just us now. I love our family, but I love our quiet moments together even more." "Me too." They drifted off to sleep in each other's arms, the way they had every night for 40 years, and Adelaide felt at peace. Whatever time they had left, whether it was days or years or decades, she knew they would face it together. Harrison lived to be 78 years old, remaining active and engaged with the ranch and his family until the very end. When he passed peacefully in his sleep one autumn night, Adelaide was devastated but also grateful that he had been spared a long decline or painful illness. She stood at his graveside, surrounded by their children and grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren, and she thought about the life they had shared. 52 years of marriage, of partnership, of love that had deepened and matured into something truly extraordinary. "He was a good man," Emma said, putting her arm around her mother's shoulders. "The best father anyone could ask for." "He was the best of men," Adelaide agreed, her voice thick with emotion, "and he gave me the best life." In the months after Harrison's death, Adelaide struggled with the loneliness. After more than 5 decades of having him by her side, his absence was a physical ache that never quite went away. But she was surrounded by family who loved her and supported her, and she found comfort in her memories and in the legacy they had built together. She lived for another 12 years, remaining sharp and engaged until the very end. She got to know her great-grandchildren and even lived to see the birth of her first great-great-grandchild. She continued to be involved with the ranch, offering advice and wisdom to the younger generation who now ran it. On what would have been her and Harrison's 64th wedding anniversary, Adelaide went up to that rocky outcropping where they had gone every year. It was harder to make the climb now, but she was determined. She stood at the edge and looked out over the land that had been her home for so many years. "We did it, my love," she said softly, speaking to Harrison as if he were standing beside her. "We built something that will last. Our children are happy and our grandchildren are thriving. The ranch is in good hands. We did it together, just like we always did everything." The wind rustled through the sage, and Adelaide could almost hear Harrison's voice in it, telling her she had done well, that he was proud of her, that he was waiting for her. Adelaide passed away peacefully in her sleep a few weeks later, at the age of 87. Her family mourned her deeply, but also celebrated a life lived fully and well. They buried her next to Harrison on the ranch they had built together, under the vast Nevada sky they had both loved. At the funeral, Emma stood to speak about her mother. "My mother was the strongest person I ever knew," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "She faced terrible loss at a young age, but she didn't let it destroy her. She built a life and a family and a legacy that will endure for generations. And she did it with the love of her life by her side, my father, who understood her completely and loved her unconditionally." Emma paused, wiping tears from her eyes. "My mother once told me that the greatest gift anyone had ever given her was my father's ability to just be present with her, especially in her darkest moments. She said that he taught her that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone is just to sit quietly with them and let them feel what they need to feel. That's the kind of love she and my father shared, and that's the kind of love they taught all of us to look for in our own lives." The family gathered at the ranch house after the funeral, sharing stories and memories and finding comfort in each other. The ranch would continue to thrive under the care of Adelaide and Harrison's descendants, a lasting testament to the love and hard work that had built it. Years later, when Emma's own grandchildren asked her about their great-great-grandmother Adelaide, Emma would tell them the story of how Adelaide had lost her father to violence and had taken a chance on a drifting cowboy named Harrison Pike, who offered to help her keep her ranch. She would tell them about how Adelaide had cried one night and Harrison had just sat there quietly with her, and how that simple act of presence had been the beginning of a love story that spanned more than half a century. "Your great-great-grandmother taught me that true love isn't about grand gestures or passionate declarations," Emma would say. "It's about showing up every day and being there for each other, in the good times and the bad. It's about partnership and respect and giving each other space to be fully human. That's what she and your great-great-grandfather had, and that's what they want for all of us." The ranch continued to prosper through the generations, and the story of Adelaide and Harrison became family legend. Their love story was told and retold, inspiring new generations to look for the kind of partnership that could weather any storm and build something lasting. And in the end, that was Adelaide and Harrison's greatest legacy. Not the land or the buildings or the material wealth, but the example of what love could be when two people committed fully to each other and to building a life together. They had shown that even in the harsh, unforgiving landscape of the Wild West, even after terrible loss and in the face of uncertainty, love could flourish and grow into something beautiful and enduring. Adelaide had never had anyone who stayed quiet when she cried, until the cowboy just sat there quietly with her. And in that moment of simple presence and understanding, a love was born that would echo through the generations. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful gesture is not to fix or explain or comfort with empty words, but simply to be there, steady and true, through whatever comes.